Here we go. So good morning, everybody. It's a really exciting session that we have today. We're going to be hearing from Jacqueline LeSage, Managing Director at Munich Re, with a very interesting story into how she came into the world of corporate venture capital. But before we get started, I wanted to quickly give you, to set the stage and give you some insight and context into this series. First of all, my name is Alba. I'm part of 500 startups. And 500, we are one of the world's most active seed stage investors with over 2,500 direct investments into startups from 75 countries. And within 500, I'm the head of global innovation strategy, where I work closely with corporate investors and innovators to power their own projects, partnerships, and investments into startups. And about 6 months ago, we started the CVC Insider Series as part of our efforts to build a stronger and more supportive ecosystem for founders, corporates, and investors alike, allowing for connections to be made, insights and best practices to be shared. So if you'd like to connect with our community of over 1,000 investors from around the world, both corporate and financial investors alike, please feel free to shoot me an email, which I'm now going to be dropping into the chat. And we're hosting this roundtable bi-weekly, featuring some of the world's top corporate venture capital practitioners, sharing their own unique story into CVC, what were some of the challenges faced, best practices they've developed as a result. So if you have any speaker you'd like to nominate for a series, also feel free to let us know. And for today, our host, Nicolas Sauvage, will be moderating our discussion, but there's also a Q&A function. So feel free to drop any questions into that section, and we'll do our best to address them as we go along. So now that you know what is going on, I'm going to hand it over to Nicolas. Please take it away. Enjoy.
Thank you, Alba. Today is going to be very special. I think we have Jacqueline, head of CVC of Munich Re. Just to set the scene, Munich Re in the last ranking of the global corporate venturing got a team in the rising star, in the emerging leaders, and herself in the power list at number 17. So I think we are going to hear a lot of good insights today. Now that I put enough pressure, Jacqueline, all yours.
Great, thank you. And thank you to 500 Startups for hosting this, and for having this, and to you, Nicolas, for hosting this. Having watched a few of them now to prepare, I so wish that when I had gotten going doing CVC, that something like this had existed, because the learnings are huge. So Nicolas wants me to start talking about the career path, right? And a little bit about who am I. And I think the main thing to know about the career path is this was no direct career path, right? So I certainly knew nothing of venture capital when I was growing up in rural Midwestern United States. Never had heard of it. But I did hear somehow about investment banking. And it was also a period of renewed globalization. And that really influenced the early phases of my career. So during my higher education years around college and business school, I got a lot of experience around infrastructure, particularly for telecom and transportation, project finance, spent a number of years living in China, and getting exposure to the capital markets intersections with all of those. So really a foundation in what's critical to building an economy from an infrastructure standpoint and a financial services side. And that was super sort of mission oriented for me, because when you go back through history, you can really see how cities and city-states throughout history rise and fall based on their role at the intersection of trade and transport and the financial services that go around them. So I somehow wove some real meaning into that has been with me through today and gives me meaning in what I do. But while those things sound like very mature, the role that I was playing was very entrepreneurial at that point. So for example, when I was doing consulting and living in Asia, again, this was right when globalization was picking up again, and consulting firms and investment banking firms were opening up offices in Asia, particularly in Hong Kong, and just plopping people down on the ground. Myself and a partner were really the first two people on the ground in Hong Kong for our firm. And over time, we built up that Hong Kong client base and capability and added offices in China and then broader in Asia and, training all the new consultants and as Asia got bigger. And so it was really entrepreneurial, starting from, 2 people in a project office, not a lot of structure, and we sort of made it all up. And I really love that sort of flying by the seat of our pants. And I loved the content of what we were doing because it was all those things, infrastructure, China, project finance, et cetera. But yet, for whatever reason, then I took a detour. So in the late 1990s, I chose to go to a very different space, and I left consulting. I got very interested in a version of interactivity around clickable video. So the idea was, okay, we got the web and it's all text, but hey, there's going to be video and TV is going to become some sort of new form, and we're going to have other forms of video and we're going to interact with it. And so I moved to Silicon Valley from Hong Kong, and I really had no idea what was going on here in the 1990s and arrived a little unprepared for the dot-com bubble. But I found a co-founder, and we had relevant image processing expertise and patents. And so we got it going. And it was very exciting. But ultimately, we learned one of the classic lessons of venture, which is timing is everything. And we were just too early. And interestingly, a few years later, one of the prominent VCs that was engaged with us as things were ending, as the dot-com bubble was bursting, came back and said, hey, why don't we get the band together? You'll restart the company, we'll fund that, and then we'll guarantee funding your Series A. And another interesting lesson in timing, because neither my co-founder nor I were still passionate about that at that time. So we didn't do that. But the experience was phenomenal because I got the whole experience around having a startup, right? And raising money, what's the funding arc? What are the deal terms? How do you engage with VCs? How do you engage with your board? How do you deal with hiring and firing and just everything around that venture process, which obviously has become super important nowadays. I'm just going to skip time a little bit. So then I had my daughter, and not long after that, a good friend of mine, Beth, from undergrad, she reached out to me. And we knew each other really well, both personally and professionally. We were friends in college. We co-ran a business-oriented student group. And when I went on to consulting, I recruited her to the same firm. She was a year after me, and now she was still there. And so she reached out to me and she said, hey, I don't know if you're looking for a job, interested in insurance, or willing to move to Hartford, Connecticut from San Francisco. But I know something that would be a great fit for you. And so my answer was kind of no. But when someone who knows you so well thinks they found a fit for you, you must honor that and look at it. And so I did. And so the first person I met with, and this is from another insurance company called The Hartford, and it's a primary carrier. It's not to be confused with Hartford Steam Boiler, which we'll talk about later. But so I met this executive from The Hartford, and they were really looking for someone to do strategy, group strategy. And I didn't want to do group strategy. I like to really get stuff done. But it turned out that they had a new head of the property and casualty business, and he was also really interested in getting innovation and venturing capabilities up. And I said, that I'm interested in. And so I went and I looked at the greater Hartford area and thought it'd be a lovely place to live with a 2-year-old. And so moved the family and joined. And so at the Hartford, we set up, we were one of the first primary carriers to set up a direct corporate venture capital investing capability. And this was long before InsurTech was a thing. And then we also had an innovation capability where we would take new offerings from just an idea and launch it out into the market. So we were pretty early for doing that sort of thing in insurance. But it was really, really exciting, very foundational for being able to set up a venture group and set up innovation at that time. It was a much smaller community of corporate VCs, but everybody was very tight and you could learn so much from each other. And it was wonderful. And we had a number of successes, made a number of investments, and launched some products into market. But then the 2008, 2009 financial crisis hit. And that was really challenging for the company. And ultimately, they ceased all of these sorts of activities. And so I left. And so at that point, I joined Jump Associates, which at this point is like a 25-year-old boutique consulting firm focused on innovation and on corporate innovation. And I joined them to advise companies on how to set up innovation capabilities, as well as corporate VCs. But I really missed doing it. And I really especially missed the corporate VC side. So while I was there, a good friend of mine from when I was doing VC at the Hartford, he was now a management consultant, and he was advising Hartford Steam Boiler, a subsidiary of Munich Re, on setting up the first corporate venture capital group within Munich Re. So I'll come back and explain Munich Re in a moment, but I was really excited about that opportunity. It got into, the HSB part got into areas of insurance that I liked more because they were commercial and around industrial IoT and around, the built environment. And then there was Munich Re behind that, and there was zero contact and zero promise there would ever be anything with Munich Re if I joined and led this small venture team for Hartford Steam Boiler. But knowing what I knew about insurance and knowing the way that Munich Re is behind everything, whether it's natural, supporting the world with natural catastrophes, supporting innovation when humans go into space. I had known coming out of the Hartford that if I did CVC again, I really would want to do it at a reinsurance company. So when Hartford Steam Boiler turned around and said, "Hey, thanks for being a thought partner for us as we get this set up. Now that we've got it approved, would you be interested in running it?" I jumped at the chance. I did ask if I could please continue living in San Francisco, which they were nice enough to say yes, as much as I enjoy going to Hartford. But I took the role and it was, super exciting. So that's kind of how I got to where I am. I can go now into what is reinsurance and what is Munich Re Ventures. Does that sound okay?
Thank you, Jacqueline. Yeah, I think it would be helpful because then there will be questions about how do you define your investment thesis around this? So yes, please.
Okay. So let's start with what is reinsurance and even what is primary insurance. So primary insurance is the insurance that you buy as an individual at your homeowner's insurance, your auto insurance, or if you set up a business, your business insurance. So they're taking the primary risk. A reinsurer, this is kind of my loose way of talking about it. A reinsurer, and particularly Munich Re, plays in two different ways. So one is they're there standing behind those normal insurance products that you're familiar with, taking on the risk above which the primary carrier wants to take. So you can think about it like a backstop, or they only take certain risks. But when things get kind of too big for the primary carrier to handle, it goes on to the reinsurer. And so a lot of times that's around kind of when bad stuff happens, that reinsurer is there and covers it. There's another thing that reinsurers, and particularly Munich Re, do, and that's about ensuring what I think about as human innovation and invention. So whenever there's new things going on in the world, there's some sort of risk transfer that needs to happen. So the thing I learned early on in my career was like project finance. Someone's going to build an amazing new bridge across in China to get to Macau, and that bridge has technology risks and it also has financial risks, and there's going to be an insurance role that plays a part in keeping everything together. But then there's also these projects have other sorts of risk, and so if you're going to send if you've got a non-governmental program sending rockets into space or sending small satellites into space, that's major human invention. And there's no standard insurance product for that. But Munich Re will come in and write those sorts of unique situations, really supporting human invention. Because if someone wasn't there to take those risks, it'd be so much harder for humans to innovate and to go to those faraway places. Just like if there weren't insurance companies there of any sort, we all couldn't drive on the highway really safely. So that explains a bit about what what a reinsurer is. And so they're taking a lot of that extra risk. And then they have to have a really big balance sheet and a really diversified risk or peril-wise and global-wise balance sheet in order to handle when those big things happen.
That's very interesting. Actually, I think you're answering in some ways one of my questions I have in the back of my mind when you said you were very clear you didn't want to join an insurance CVC, but more of a reinsurance CVC. And part of it is these frontier use cases, things that have not been done before.
I think that's absolutely part of it, right? And so as, you know, when I was in the primary carrier, and even still today for many of the primary carrier CVCs, of which now there are many, you know, there's a lot of focus on the digital transformation of those companies. The legacy systems of insurance companies are very challenging and they're very constraining, and it constrains their ability to be fast. It constrains the ability to develop new product. And it's just very challenging. And a reinsurer doesn't have that same situation, where all of our workflows are not quite as not underpinned in the same way by that kind of workflow IT. And so the primary carriers spend a lot of time focusing on the IT, the enabling IT for their workflow, as well as enabling data. We focus on that data also. But we're very focused on really a couple of different things. What are big things going on in the world that are going to change our built environment and change the way risk works and where risk is going to be? Another is, what are technologies and data that are going to dramatically change how we underwrite and price risk and create opportunities for new risks to be written or new types of products? And then another one is, there are companies that are getting started that need certain special kinds of insurance or insurance parts and pieces when they launch. So for example, you know, back when I was at the Hartford, there was no insurtech. Now there's all these insurtech companies, and for them to launch, they need at least reinsurance, if not another thing called fronting from a primary carrier. And so Munich Re has set up a business in order to provide that to them. And so we're able to enable these new sort of insurance companies with the parts and pieces that they need. We have another business that offers performance guarantees for companies for startups that have a lot of AI involved, and it sort of de-risks the go-to-market strategy for those startups by guaranteeing their AI, which is viewed as quite valuable. So it's a little bit of detail, but the point there is that we're focusing a lot on some of these bigger business model things, new types of products, rather than focusing on enabler technology that we need to transform our business. And many of the primary carriers do some of that as well, but we don't really do that at all. So
I think I will have quite a few good questions about investment thesis, because you're really at the exploration. You're looking at what's going to change dramatically in the world. I want to go back first to your personal introduction, which is really, really nice. One question, which is more on the personal side, is the fact you actually had experience working in a different continent. How much of that do you think shaped your career?
It's an interesting question. I think that it has to be hugely impactful. But the impactful moment is the impactful thing, the fact that I wanted to do that and sought that out, and that meant something about who I was as a person and what I liked. Because I didn't just get put there. I told my consulting firm, I've moved out of my apartment and put my stuff in storage, and I'm moving to Hong Kong in 2 months, with or without you. Do you have something I could do? And so I was going no matter what. And so I think there's something about the desire to do that gameness and willing to just land somewhere and know nothing, that is defining.
Yep. Yeah. I think if I look at all the moves you made, one thing is clear, is that you're not worried about going outside your zone of comfort or your zone of knowledge. Very good. One thing you said also is, from your experience as an entrepreneur, is the learning about being too early. And of course, when we invest as corporate VCs or VCs, you want to kind of invest just a bit too early, because if it's becoming obvious, then you pay the normal price for everyone. If you're too late, then that's really not good. How much of that experience of being too early sometimes create a bias where you're maybe too cautious, or actually you're aware of the value of it?
I haven't found that it's leading to be too cautious, because I tend to more have a view that some things are already a little done. But there still ends up being a category of things sometimes where it really is just where it's too early, or where it might be too early, but that just means you have to go about the market a certain way and be ready for it. Maybe, thinking extrovertedly here, maybe that's more of the impact that it has is on that. And understanding what needs to be true for it to not be too early.
So we have a question from Hala, which is kind of a double click. How early do you invest?
So Munich Re Ventures invests from seed to Series D. So we've been the first money into a company at the time that it's incorporating, and we've led a Series D. I think we prefer A and B and a little bit of seed, but we've done the whole gamut.
Very nice. And then going back to this entrepreneur's experience, as an investor, how do you think it is impacting the way you engage, review, assess, support the entrepreneurs?
So I think having been an entrepreneur gives me a lot of empathy for the role. And it's a really tough role to be a founder. And so I think that there's a way in which having been an entrepreneur influences how I act as an investor and a board member. But then there's also the things I learned more tactically from being an entrepreneur that I start pattern matching around, right? But in terms of the things around being a board member, you have, when you're on a board, you have certain expertise that you bring. You also have certain things that that are sort of your set of issues that you tend to like to look at, and the lens through which you look at a company, and you sort of repeat that a little bit. But a full board is a bunch of people all doing that. And each founder is going to be different. Some are brand new, some are experienced. You have different levels of skills and interests of the other board members. And I tend to take a look at a lot at the board dynamics and the board makeup, and find a way to adjust what I do in order to be supplemental to that, to both be a good thought partner and confidant for the founder, and as well as to balance out if there's, say, something going on that's super harsh, or something's going on and we're not pushing hard enough, then I'll try to push hard. But I think that it's trying to make sure that board as a whole is able to be as value add and a support to the founder as possible. So it's not just about me, it's about how can I also make that board be more helpful. And there's times when, like, after a board meeting, I'll have a conversation with the founder or the CEO, and, we'll talk about, what do we think about the makeup of the board when we do the next fundraising round, or if we're bringing on an independent, what do we think is going to be the best thing to add in order to balance the board out better? Those are a lot of things that are always very much on my mind.
I really like what you're saying about the board dynamic, because if the board is quite the same, either too nice or too hard, that doesn't really help the entrepreneur, the CEO. And the fact you're being very conscious about what is the level of the board and how can you change the dynamic range, I think is an interesting concept. Can you give a concrete example of when you really change that dynamic and that was really helpful for the CEO?
trying to figure out how to do that in an anonymous way. So one of our portfolio companies, for whatever reasons, has a lot of PE folks on the cap table early on. And it was interesting for me when I showed up at the first board meeting, the things we were focused on in the board meetings. And I could feel that I was more of a VC tech investor, and you could really feel that difference. And so in that case, after a few of those meetings, having a conversation with the CEO about exactly what I just said, which is, we're thinking about bringing in an independent. We talked about maybe that person should be from tech, right? And we're going to have some new investors. What should they bring to this table in order to balance out that PE focus? And then there was, can we please have board decks that when they're sent out in advance, we then don't go through 4 different versions of the financials in the board meeting? People can do that separately, so we're not driving down on a particular number. And can you also please somewhere in the deck every time include how much cash do we have left and how many months, what's our burn? Because it was sort of hidden. And so things were very much through a PE way of looking at what's the bottom line and we weren't there yet versus sort of a VC way of where are we giving our cash? And we needed to do both. And so we had conversations about the board deck and the structure of the meetings and about the folks we would want to include as we added board members.
Very nice. And one thing you said, which I've never heard before, but actually I think it makes a lot of sense, is you said how to become the confidant, which is outside the board, clearly. Can you explain what kind of best practices the audience can learn about really helping the CEO outside the board?
Yeah, and it's not like I want to become the confidant for every one of them. It's more like they're going to need a confidant, and if I'm able to be that's great. And a lot of times they go to different board members for different reasons. But I saw from my board member, one in particular, when I had my startup, how critical that role was, and it was, it ends up being sort of coaching and also being a thought partner, and so. I think you just, as a board member, you're spending a lot of time in board meetings, but you're also spending a lot of time outside of that, and you're building up your personal relationship, and you're talking about the company. And at least for me, I want to make it so that if those sessions can be really helpful as well, then that's great, because I'm available in between board meetings, and I think all board members should be. And so, for each of the different founders, they might have different reasons why we would engage or why they would engage with another board member. But I think it's critical for founders to be able to have those relationships with the board members outside of board meetings. I mean, it's kind of obvious around, whatever they get value from them. And for me, it's sort of different things in different situations.
Very nice. And you talked about empathy that came from having been an entrepreneur towards the entrepreneurs. But actually, if we look at the profile of corporate VCs, the teams inside, it's actually the minority of them that have gone through being an entrepreneur before moving into corporate venturing. And I'm sure in your team, you also have non-entrepreneurs in your team. How do you recruit and how do you coach your teams to have this empathy with entrepreneurs?
So there's a couple of different things in there. So our recruiting for our investment team is to have everyone who comes in to come in with a level of VC or CVC experience at the level that they're coming in. And then once they're there, we're not always successful, but we try to take an apprenticeship model so that the more junior people can learn and be around a lot of the activity that the more senior people are doing. So they learn about negotiating, and ideally we have an observer and a director, or at least sometimes an observer can join those conversations and debrief. And so there's a bit of an apprenticeship model around developing that empathy and being a board member. We do have a number of people who have been parts of startups, maybe not founders, but have been early employees. And I think that's helpful. That's helpful also. But, to some extent, I think anyone who's, like on my team, an investment director, and so they've been doing this for 15 years or 20 years, hopefully even though they haven't been a founder, they've built up empathy.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. Now, one thing that's very unique, also in your profile from the others we have interviewed so far, is you were in a CVC, you had the experience of one, and then you moved to a new one. And actually, it's not like you moved to a new one, you designed the new one. Can you tell the audience what you learned from your first experience that was really valuable to design the second one?
I learned so much in the first one, and some of the things I actually got to change while I was there. And then interestingly, for the second one, I didn't necessarily get to change all the things I might have wanted to up front. And it does make it harder. But I think some of the big lessons. So everyone always talks about how important it is to be, as a CVC, really connected up to the CEO. And I think that obviously that's true. It's necessary. It's not sufficient. I think it's super important to have a strong base of supporters and true believers in the next level, 1 and 2 levels down. People who, if you were taken away, it would impact their business, right? And they would fight for you. You're part of their success. I think that's really important, is to have a much broader support. And I think some corporate VCs can focus only on that CEO, and creates a lot more risk for them, because what's the average life of a CEO these days, in role? We have hard enough time as CVCs having longevity. We don't need to tie it 100% to the CEO's longevity also. So I think that's one. Second one, the third one's going to be the biggest. The second one was the importance of having experienced VCs with a network, knowing how to play the game, knowing how to develop and maintain a reputation, getting access to deals, et cetera. Very important. The third one, which has been the most critical, is around strategic value. So we're corporate VCs, strategic value first. Strategic value is hard, and there's many different models of doing corporate VC that are all strategic, but go about getting that strategic value differently. And what I learned at the Hartford was we need to have someone on our team whose job it is to create those connections and to even think about what would be the proof of concept, or what would be the pilot, or even spell it out, or even negotiate it, and kind of go as far with that is needed in order to supplement that business, in order to make something happen. Particularly at that one, it was a primary carrier. So you're doing something off cycle. They don't have any resources for anything that's not in the budget, people or time. So bringing a person to help them. And then I also had a little special budget. They could bring costs, money to run a pilot. That was huge. So then when I joined Hartford Steam Boiler, the original plan didn't have for a role like that. And I said, when I do corporate VC, this role has to be there. And so we added that in and took someone from the business who joined my team. If you fast forward to today, and actually we haven't talked much about what we are like today, but we have a whole portfolio development team. And that team has sort of 2 elements to it. It has sort of a central group that deals with frameworks and structures and making sure we're running similar processes and developing strategic themes. And then we have people who are connected up to one of our specific LPs businesses, whose job it is to really create the connections and make them happen between the businesses and the startups, so that both sides get value add. So having that portfolio development team is critical to being able to get the strategic value. And I think that's something that is a absolute requirement for me if I was going to go do this again somewhere. And I think what's interesting is you're seeing more institutional VCs do something like that. So I remember in 2008, after the financial crisis, as more corporates were doing VC, some of the traditional venture capital firms got really excited about having corporate LPs. And I spent some time with a couple of them as they tried to think about how to track corporate LPs. But those ones at least, didn't really want to do much in order to give strategic value to the corporates. They didn't realize what was going to be needed to do that. And so those efforts those two at least were not successful. But if you look at a company like Fifth Wall, which is an institutional VC, but has a whole strategy and partnership platform going on connected to the investments, it's the equivalent of my portfolio development team. I think that's fantastic.
There are so many golden nuggets. I take at least 3 and I'm going to double click on each of them. One is, it's really good. One is being part of the mothership success, not just the CEO, but really the mothership. The second one is about the strategic value and making it very clear. And the third one, which maybe is the one I double click first, because I think this is really, really tangible, is about this liaison between the startups and the mothership in a proactive way, which I think is not always what I've seen so far. And I think you call this a portfolio development, right? So do you have this proactivity even before you invest in the startup, where this team starts thinking about what could be the proof of concept and the synergies? And how do they then get KPIs to make sure they execute on what they had identified?
So in that set of lessons learned around having this sort of capability that I learned from the first one, included having well-developed themes, or you can think of it as a thesis that's developed up front and is agreed upon with some part of your company. It could be with the CEO, it could be with the businesses, but and that thesis can be really far out in a horizon, or unfortunately, sometimes it can be really near term. But the point is that you have pre-established sectors that are of importance, why they might be important, and sort of the so what. And if you do that, and then the people that you're doing it with on the business side are going to be the people that you engage with when you're looking at a startup, and ultimately if you invest in a startup, to help add value to that startup and value to the parent. So I think that I call it the pre-plugging of everything up front is critical. And that includes because it creates great relationships between our investment team and the businesses. I think where it can get problematic is if the actual engagement that's desired is too prescribed or too near term. That can be problematic, but that's not a problem of having a pre-thought out thesis. That's a problem of having a thesis that's too near term, which I would discourage. But definitely having that thought up front is key to strategic value. Otherwise, you're just investing. And then you go around knocking on doors once you've invested saying, hey, look at my pretty thing. Do you want it? That's going to have less chance of a success than when you already have, a business or businesses that are excited about you going after that space and want to see the companies that you are, that you're going to be bringing.
Yeah. And I think that's where this team really needs to be well connected to the mothership. They need to understand what they care about. So, okay, Absolutely. This is really good. And there is a triple click from the audience. So Ala is asking, how do you ensure startups still get value from a POC, even if it doesn't turn into a commercial agreement?
Well, there's a general answer, which is anytime something doesn't work out, there's negative lessons, right? And I think that's, different POCs not working out have different reasons for why they happen. But hopefully, if it doesn't happen, like because the corporate just didn't do it, well, that's one kind of negative lesson. But if it doesn't happen because it happens, but it gives the startup some learning about why, it gives the startup and the corporate learning about why that particular thing doesn't work, well, then that's really valuable. And so that just gets to the basic lesson of failures aren't always things to just be discarded. You got to learn from your failures. And so if you've got a proof of concept that doesn't work out, both the corporate and the startup should be looking at what that means, because it probably means something for what's the thing to do next, or how to change the business on the corporate side, or how to change something that the startup's doing. There's so many lessons in something not working out.
Yeah, I think when you say negative lessons, you mean negative outcome lessons, which is always valuable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
So talking of failure, we had another question from Ueno-san, which I think is a cheeky question. Can you underwrite risk of startup failure as an insurance investor?
Nice question. So interestingly enough, we have been asked that by at least one VC firm that you would know the name of. And my cheeky answer is always, one, there's a price for everything.
Exactly.
Second thing, which is, you're telling me that you want us to take all your risk out of your business, right? Then why do you get your reward?
Yep.
But to be honest, it was a little bit of a topic when the unicorns, when there became so many unicorns, and you started having situations where you were well beyond where the traditional VC funds might want to be, and the rounds were getting bigger and bigger, but they weren't exiting. And we did start hearing some interesting, cheeky requests about whether that was something we would do.
Makes sense. So back to the 3 golden nuggets. The second one is about strategic value. And here, every CVCs, I believe, are struggling with quantifying and exposing or making it very clear what is a strategic value. What's the learnings that you had through these 2 CVCs in making sure the strategic value is well understood and appreciated from the mothership?
If I had a perfect answer to that, that would be wonderful. It's hard, and it always remains hard. And where we end up keeping track of a lot of things. So I'll tell you what we keep track of, and we report out quarterly. So with every investment, there's some kind of plan for what's going to happen. And sometimes there's like a commercial agreement, and sometimes it's way further out. But whatever that plan is, and the engagement and interaction that's supposed to happen, we set that out. We have some milestones. And so we're constantly tracking to, like, did we do what we said we were going to do, sort of from a process standpoint? And is the business sort of following up in all of that? We do measure when there's a financial impact on the mothership. But I'm not a fan of that, because if there's like $10,000 in revenue to the mothership, to me, just because that's quantified, that doesn't make it more important than when you learn something qualitative that makes you take a completely different change in your strategy to something that you would have done, from what you would have done. So that's hard. We've had a couple situations where Munich Re and Hartford Steam Boiler have bought companies that either were in our portfolio or that we sourced. And another one where Munich Re, the big balance sheet, ended up making a very significant investment after we were in the A and B. And I think those are, no question, big strategic wins. But it's still not something I have an easy answer to.
I really appreciate your candid answer. I think you're right. If it was easy, or there was a best practice that's obvious to follow, everyone would say it, but it's not. The third golden nugget you mentioned was making sure you are part of the success and not just of the CEO, because you still need to survive a CEO change. Any tip for the audience about how to make sure that you're being part of versus just on the side?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what I described about the themes and pre-plugging the themes is a great way to do that, because it really gets you also involved in the strategy of the business, et cetera. So that by nature does that. And that does it sort of 2 levels down, maybe, sort of thing. The other thing for us, which I'm not sure I would recommend, is we actually have 3 funds. So we started off with $50 million for Hartford Steam Boiler, just investing from their balance sheet. But if you flash forward to today, we have 3 funds, And now they're set up like funds, each with a different limited partner that's a business. So Hartford Steam Boiler still has its fund. Ergo, which is a primary carrier owned by Munich Re, has its own fund. And then the reinsurance group has its fund. And we've more than 10x'd the fund dollars or fund equivalent. And each of those three funds has a different investment committee, with me being the only common across it. And those investment committees have the most senior people of those businesses. So that gives that sort of next level, the true business leaders and direct reports to the CEOs are involved with us actively as our investment committee. So I can tell you that that model I just described is really complex and difficult to run and navigate, but we have a lot of people that care about us being successful and for whom we're an important part of their own strategies and messaging out to their stakeholders.
I think what come across is a very conscious decision of having many, many touch points with the mothership, all the way to the investment this committee who can make decisions and inputs. Any best practice on how to choose your investment committee and the size and the ability to contribute?
I like when it includes the most senior folks. I think it's problematic when you have a business owner, one of the actual businesses that's going to engage directly with the startup on there. I don't think that's appropriate because of the bright lines you need to have around information. I do think more and more that the trend toward having the VC team making the decisions within a predefined thesis, I think is helpful. And then having more of an advisory board role for some of those senior executives. I think we're seeing more and more of that, including as we see more and more CVCs get started with more independence. So I think finding a way for the decision making and the process to run with the VC team, but having an advisory role for the business, that's a really important one, including of setting and agreeing on the themes and the thesis is critical.
Very nice. Maybe a double click on.
Small. They should be small. They shouldn't be like more than 5 people.
I see. Yeah, I agree with that. And on the advisory comment you just made, do you think it's a good practice, not a good practice, a best practice to have someone from the business being on the board of a startup you invest in?
We tend to keep a pretty bright line there because of the liability issues. And also, whenever we're investing in a company, and particularly if it's a really competitive one with really strong investors, it's hard enough to try to get our experienced VC and CVC folks to be in the room and on the board. And like anyone, you've got to show you have to bring your reputation. And then as we know, once you're in that boardroom, a lot of the stuff that you're dealing with isn't necessarily the stuff that the BU would be wanting to deal with the startup. You're dealing with HR issues, you're dealing with the next funding round, you're dealing with questions around an exit, all sorts of different stuff. And it's really not stuff that the business has expertise in and hasn't sat on board. So my feeling tends to be you need people in the boardrooms who've gone through funding arc and life arcs of startups because they know all the things that are involved. And you also need to keep a bright line between that private information of the startup and the business. And when you start putting business people on the board, you're not necessarily adding the value that's needed for the board. That doesn't mean they don't add value, but they're not bringing the full range, and that the things that business person most likely brings might be better off in a different way, like a steering committee for an activity that's going on with the startup, or for an advisory board that the startup might have. So
I think you just gave I think you just gave the most articulate explanation of what I've heard from many, many people. So thank you for walking through the logic. I think that's really helpful. Now we move into the investment portion, and clearly you have very good proactive touch points with Munich Re and the other companies. How do you define your investment thesis. And clearly you have 3 funds, so you probably have differences between them. And on top of them, I'm interested to see how you define investment thesis differently as a reinsurer versus a primary care.
So as I mentioned, we have 3 funds, and so 3 investment committees. And we also pre-plug our themes up front. So we have at varying times somewhere between 8 and 12 investment themes. And those investment themes are specific to a fund, and an investment committee approves it. And that investment theme basically contains the investment thesis, right? So it's what's going on in the strategy of the business, what's going on in the venture world, and what's at the intersection of that we think that we and the business think matter to each other, and what would they want to partner around now or in the future, or what would they want to learn? And then given that, what would make it attractive to us to invest? So we sort of try to think about that up front. We often violate a lot of that, to be honest, because we think, but it's meant to give us a starting point to align on why we're all doing this. And it also makes us go faster, right? It's like, I always use, I use this metaphor about, you have a dog, and the dog might get out in the backyard and it catches a squirrel. But it doesn't know what to do once it catches a squirrel, but it wants so badly to catch the squirrel. We want to make sure that when we catch something that we know what we're going to do with it, right? And so the pre-plugging helps to make sure that we know what's going to happen. It doesn't mean we have to have certainty about a commercial agreement, but it means we know that we're going to talk with this startup about these certain topics that we think are going to be relevant together.
I'm happy you mentioned about violating the rules, because I think you need to be very clear about what you want to invest and not invest. But along the way, you need to have flexibility of mind that when you see something special, you should be able to address it. And it's interesting, your investment committee is the one approving the investment thesis. Can you, actually, this is a question also from the audience, which is, how many people are involved in the investment approval or validation process before it even go back to the IC?
So that depends a little bit on the theme. It could be a couple people from my team and just 1 or 2 people on the business side. It really depends on the theme. I think if what they're getting at most likely is, aren't you guys really slow? and the thing is when we've got a theme that's pre-plugged, and when what we're doing is looking at something that's in a theme, we can go really, really fast. So in that situation, we can go in like 3 weeks or 4 weeks. We don't hold up deals when it's that situation. When it gets complicated is when we're doing something outside of a theme.
Okay. So that's really the value of this pre-plug.
It is, exactly. And we can go super duper fast. And our investment committees, when we set them up with real expectations about speed. So getting a hold of our investment committees and getting a decision made is not even close to being an issue. The issue is when there's an issue, it's because it's not really in a theme. And then we have to figure out how to get it done. And sometimes those get approved, but it takes a different amount of work and sometimes it can be late. So.
Very nice. So I left the most inspiring questions for last. We're in the last 5 minutes. First, what's your biggest challenge today? And what do you think you can do to push the boundary?
So my biggest challenge today is that when I got started with Hartford Steam Boiler and negotiated around what this corporate VC would look like. Subsequently, we expanded, 10x in dollars and added 2 new funds. And there wasn't the same ability to to determine up front what we were going to be. They had ideas and da-da-da. And so what that means is we're always evolving our platform, and that rather than having it set up front and then running with it. Now, as we know, CVCs are always evolving, or they evolve every few years, sort of. But we're sort of always in transition. And so I would like to have had the ability to sort of set the whole thing up front. But to be honest, I don't know that we could have done that at the time for a number of reasons. And but I would like to be at a point where we're just more stable for a period of time. But that's my biggest challenge is the constant evolution of the program.
And I think that's true for every CVC that want to keep doing better and better. So the last question is really for the audience who are thinking about going into corporate venturing or just getting started. What do you think are the key elements in establishing a team of successful CVC investors?
Having experienced VC people, CVC or VC. But you probably need people who have had both experiences. So having people that fill the C in CVC and the VC, the CVC and the VC, right? And that I think is number one, is picking people who know how to do venture and know how to engage with a corporation. That really is super duper important. And then I think the apprenticeship model is very important because you want to be able to advance people in their careers, and you only learn in this business from experiencing it. And so making sure that you're giving those opportunities to the more junior folks on the team to participate in the boardrooms or to get debriefed from that, or things that you want to do that. And the third thing is to develop perspective, to make sure that you're in a space enough, having coverage, that you can develop conviction and perspective on what's happening in the space and what good looks like, right? Some investors more follow along what other people are doing and look at that for their guidance. And I think there's certainly a lot of positive signaling that comes from who other co-investors are, and you never want to overlook it, and you want to have the best co-investors possible. But I think it's also important to have your own thesis and conviction and perspective, and we work hard on that as well.
Very nice. Jacqueline, I want to thank you. You gave a lot of insights. It's amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Good luck with the rest of the series.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.